Welcome to Lesson 10 in the C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to look at connecting to our SQL database. In the last video, we built the prize form, but we only wired it up to the class that pretended to talk to SQL. Now we're going to actually take out that sample code and put real code in place to talk to SQL. So let's jump right in. Here we have our solution, our two projects, and just by way of review, down here in the Tracker UI, which is our user interface, in the program.cs, we made a couple of modifications. The first thing we did was we added this line right here. And what this does is it wires up which database or databases we're going to talk to. So in this case, we're connecting to both SQL and the text file. And then next, we change the application run from the tournament dashboard form, which is going to be our final form, the actual real form. We change it to our prize or create prize form so we can kind of test things out and make sure things work. So those are a couple of the important changes we made to the program.cs, which is where our application will start, since Tracker UI is the bolded of the two projects, which means it's the startup project. So before we jump in today, I want to make a couple of modifications to our library though. The first modification is I want to clean things up a bit. So I'm going to right click on my library and say add new folder. And I call this folder models. And then I'm going to drag anything that says models at the end into this folder. Just click and drag. And there you go. So there's a folder filled with models. And that just helps kind of keep things clean, because now I can do this. And all of a sudden, instead of having, 8 or 10 CS files in this one list, all the same level, we can now kind of break these out by level. Now that didn't change anything on how those models work. The folder structure really doesn't matter, except, and here's the one exception, if I were to add a new item now. So if I right click and say add new class, and let's just leave this as class 1 since we're going to delete it. I want to show you the one change that happens. So let's look at team model for a minute. Team model, the namespace is tracker library. If we go to class 1, the namespace is tracker library.models. And that's because by default, what happens is that when you're inside a folder and you add something new, it takes the path of the namespace, it takes from the project name and then any path down to it. So if I had models and then in here a folder called people, it would say tracker library.models.people. So that's just something to note. Now when you drag a model or a class in here, when it was not created here, it will not add that into the namespace. Because adding that namespace would break our application, because we are pointing to the root of this for all of these models, if we are using them. Most of them we aren't using yet. But that means you have a choice to make. You can either change the namespace on all of these to match this tracker library.models, or you can leave it off. If you leave it off, then you'll have to, anytime you add a new one, just take it off as well. And that's really up to you. It's whether you want to have that separate out or not. I kind of do. And the reason why is because that way it differentiates. This is a model versus this then I would need to add that using statement in order to bring in these models without putting the path models dot team model. See, if I put models dot, it's happy now because it knows what the namespace is, because again, the beginning is actually assumed. The beginning would be the tracker library. So that's the full path. But this is assumed because we are in the tracker library namespace. So now we can take that off, and we'll actually take that off as well. And we're now in the models library. All right, we can delete that class 1. That was just an example. Okay, so there we go. We've got our models inside a model folder. And now I'm going to do a little more cleanup. I'm going to do another folder. I'm going to call this folder Data Access. And these names aren't necessarily really important. It's just for me to know what this is for. And so in this case, I'm going to move, and here's the debate, global config. Do I move that into data access? I say no, because it's not really about data access, it's about configuration. And so I'm going to leave it alone, but I will move the iData connection, the SQL connector, and the text connection. And that also brings up another issue, which is this is named differently than this. We have SQL connector and text connection. So I'm actually going to rename text connection to text connector. So let's rename this to text connector. And it's going to say, would you like to also rename the project and all its references to text connection? So what it does, it says over here, oop, it was named text connection. Let's change it to text connector, which is why I renamed it over here in the file name first, because that renamed the class name. It does not go the other direction. So therefore, if you need to do a rename it over here, and then it will fix this if you say yes to that dialog box. Now I've got a dialog yelling at me saying, hey, I don't know what prize model is. That's because we don't have a using statement for tracker library.models. So if I do my control dot, using tracker library.models, that puts it right there. And now life is good again. And now this iData connector or connection is yelling at me because it's saying I am not implementing properly the create prize interface. And it's actually not really true, but what happens is if you come over here to our interface, it says I don't know what prize model is. But if I say using tracker library.models and I save that and I come back, this should be good now. And it is. And SQL connector, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do the control dot, add the using statement so we can change this so it works. And we'll save that. In fact, we'll save all. This little two save icons together is a save all, which means it saves all of my files here, which is nice. So now I can move these files, the iData connection, I'm going to drag in a data access, the SQL connector, and the text connector. And now we can actually change that namespace if we like, which I do. .data access. Now how do I know that's the new namespace it should be? Well, that's because this is the name of the folder, and it is case sensitive. So it's going to yell at me for a bit. No worries. We're going to change our namespaces here. That should solve that problem. Then global config. It's referencing the iData connection, so I need to change to add the using statement for using tracker library.data access. and that solves the world's problems. So now I've kind of cleaned up my tracker library. It's a little more logical. Now I have my data access folder, I have my models folder, and then I just have global config right in the root. The last thing I want to do is actually do a build solution, because I'm assuming there's going to be other issues that I've missed. In fact, right there, I got a red squiggly. The build failed, it said. It's got 3 errors. So if I come here and say view code, it says I did a connection, prize model. I don't know what these things are. So if I hit control dot, add the using statement. And then down here again, control dot, add the using statement. Now see, there's 2 different using statements because one is for .data access, one's for .models. But with that being said, now if I build the solution, everything works. If you see in the lower left-hand corner, build succeeded. So now we can actually get to writing that data access code. And that's a lot of extra work before we actually got to our quote-unquote real work. But I want this project to be as close to real world as possible. And this is real world. You know, real world is you come back to a project and go, oh man, I was coding late at night and made some mistakes, like calling one connector and one connection. Is it a big deal? Not really, but at the same time, having that consistency of calling the same thing the same way every time really helps you when you're looking for a new thing. You know, so if we were going to look for a new data connector and it said data connection instead of data connector, we'd be a little confused. Is that really the same thing, or is that something different? And so by naming it connector every time, then I know that, yes, this is the same thing because it fits the same pattern. So that's just something to keep in mind. And again, cleanup, that's not something you should let wait until the end of the project, just like documentation isn't. These are things you should be doing as you go, because it's fresh in your mind now, and it's also much easier to change. You saw the number of tweaks I had to do to change those namespaces, and they were just for one form. I had those namespace changes to do. So if I had all of my forms wired up, even this small project, it would still be a much more significant change. I have to do a number of changes. And so the earlier you can do these changes, the better. And just make sure when you come back to a project that you look it over and make sure things are clean in the way you want them. All right, so on to the actual work of today. So let's right click on this tab and say close all documents. I just want to close everything out. I know the document I wanted was open, but it's just easier to clear everything else out and start again opening things up. So in the SQL connector, we have this to do right here, or we could have gone to our task list and looked for that to do, which is right here. And double click it, it would take us to it. In fact, let's close it down, double click this, and there you go. Just to show you that that's a quick way to navigate your project. It's also a quick way to remind yourself of what I need to do yet in order to get this project to work. Because notice there's actually 3 there. There's one for wiring up the text files and then set up the SQL connector properly. So in that one right there says, yep, that's not right. So let's go back here and start planning out how we're going to wire this up. And this is important to get right because we're going to do this over and over and over again for all of our different forms. So let's think this through a minute and start planning out how we're going to do it. Now we're going to use Dapper as our connection ORM. And an ORM is just a tool that helps you connect to a data source like SQL in an easier manner. It helps kind of take away some of the complexities of connecting to a SQL server. So I love Dapper because it's practically as fast as doing it with just straight C#. I used to do just ADO.NET which is a little more complicated, especially when you start getting into the data sets and data tables and converting a data table to a list of model and all that went into it. Whereas now a Dapper, it kind of just does it for us and it takes us straight to our list of model. And yet it's almost as fast as the way I was doing it, which was the fastest way you can do it. We could use other tools like Entity Framework, but Entity Framework can be quite a bit slower to the point where it's 10 times slower than even Dapper. And so I don't like to use Entity Framework. It's also much more complex. And you can find out all my views about Entity Framework in my YouTube video on connecting to SQL from C#. But to start with, let's add a reference. Manage NuGet packages. We're going to add a reference to Dapper. So go to Browse and just start typing Dapper. Hit Enter. This first one right here. We'll install the latest stable version. Just click Install, wait for it to be done. All right, there we go. So now it's installed. We can close out of this. And so now we can see in the references, we have Dapper right here. So now how we're going to use Dapper? Well, the first thing you need to do is we need to use Dapper with a connection string. If you've watched my YouTube video, I just mentioned the C# SQL connection. We have to have in our app.config a connection string. That's the best way to do it. That way we can change it even while the application is running. It's not hard code in our code. And it also allows it to do some other things with it as well. But in the app.config, notice the app.config is not in our library. It would seem to make sense it'd be in our library because this is where we're going to actually do all of our work with Dapper. The UI doesn't know anything about Dapper. It just knows I call this method right here, I pass in a prize model, I get back a prize model. That's all it cares about. In here is where we're going to do Dapper. But this is just a DLL. The DLL doesn't actually have a user interface, and it also does not have a .config file, whether it's a web.config or an app.config. And so instead it uses the config file from the user interface, which means that the connection string actually goes in this tracker UI app.config file. And so here is where we'll put our connection string. To do that, under configuration, we're going to do our less than sign to open up a new section and type connection strings. Close that out. And inside here, we're going to add our new connection string. So we're going to say add name equals, and this is any name you want to give it. I typically give it the name of my database. Oops. So we call this tournaments. And then I'm going to say connection string equals, and inside here I have to first give it my server. In my case, it's ./SQL 2016. And a semicolon database. And that's tournaments. Trusted underscore connection equals true. What that trusted connection is, it's saying use my Windows credentials in order to connect table structure to write to the tables or anything else. They just have access to stored procedures. That way, the permissions they have, if they were to take those credentials, are the exact same as if they were going to use this application, which is what you want. So that's the connection string. If you go to, again, if you watch my video, I cover much more depth connecting to SQL. But if you go to connectionstrings.com, I believe, just Google connection strings. They'll show you all the different connection strings for SQL and all the rest that you can connect to. And finally, provider name equals system.data.SQL client. And that's just saying use the SQL connection or SQL client for connecting to this database. All right, so that's our connection string. Why is a connection string important? Well, this string right here tells Dapper how to get to SQL Server and then how to get in. So it says, here's the path of SQL Server. Here's the database you're going to start in. Now you can go to any database with this with these credentials if you have permission. But this is the default one. And what that means is it's kind of like a namespace where if you're in the Tournaments database, you don't have to specify, I want something from the Tournaments database. So it just makes life a little bit easier. And then finally, the trusted connection just says, these are the permissions I have. So location of the SQL Server, default database, and what permissions there are. So Dapper needs that in order to talk to SQL Server. And we can have as many as you want as far as connection strings in this list. So we can just do an add down below this line and add another one. Also note that this string right here can be transformed with a config transform. So on build, if I do a debug build, I could transform it to something else. If I do a release build, I could transform it to something different. So for example, at my company, we have multiple transforms, one for the development server, one for the staging server, one for the production server, and then a couple other miscellaneous ones. And we're not going to get into transforms today. We're just going to leave it as it is and call it good. That'll be for a different video. We don't want to make this too long. So back over here, we now have a connection string in place, and we call it tournaments. So we can rely on that, but how do we even get our connection string? Well, I can go over to the global configs file. I'm actually going to add a new entry here, a new public static void. Let's just kind of, we can't really scroll up here yet. There we go. All right, public static, and it's not a void, it's going to be a string. Public static string, and we'll call this CNN value, and that's connection value, or connection string, let's call it that. And then we'll pass in a name of the connection string we want to get. All right. And let's just call that name. All right. So what it's going to do is it's going to go to the app.config and get me the connection string by looking up this name. And it's going to look up this name and then return for me the value inside of this string. So this right here. So I give it this, it gives me this. And this is pretty simple. The code is configuration manager dot connection strings, oops, square brackets, name dot connection string. And we'll return all of that. Now it's yelling at me because we don't have access to this namespace. And in fact, if you do the control dot, there's not a add using statement for that. And that's because we have to right click on references and say add reference, come to assemblies, Now life is good. Now, whenever anyone calls global config.cnn string and passes in tournaments for the name, they'll get back this string right here. So that's perfect. Now back here again. So I've done a couple of setup things. Now I need to actually put some kind of code in here that does something. So let's get rid of our sample code. I'm going to add a using statement. Using, and then the open parens, IDB connection. And that's not in the using statement list, therefore I do control dot using system.data and say connection equals new system.data .SQL client .SQL connection, and I can say global config dot CNN string, and then quotes inside the parens, I'm going to say tournaments. Now that's a lot for one line, but that's okay. So now what this is I've said I want to create a new IDB connection. Now notice the I in the front, which we've now realized means an interface. And destroyed properly. And so that way, this prevents against memory leaks. So it used to be that if your application, had an exception or did something weird when you were trying to connect to a database, you could accidentally leave a connection open. And if you do this long enough, then you have lots of connections open. And your SQL Server gets slower and slower, and your application gets slower and slower. And you're wondering, what's going on? My computer's bogging down, my application memory usage is going through the roof, and all this other stuff. And it's because of memory leaks, because you had crashes and other unexpected circumstances that prematurely got you out of code but didn't close the connection to the database properly. This using statement fixes that. What it says is, it doesn't matter what happens. When you hit the end of this curly brace, whether it's through exception, through anything else, when you hit the end, we're closing it down. And so that's just a real safe way to connect your database in such a way that you don't leave connections open. What that does mean, though, is I'm not going to open a connection at this root level of the class and then reuse it over and over for different methods. I'm going to open this connection every single time. So now we have our connection to the database, but what do we do with that connection? We haven't really decided how this data goes in the database. So let's go over the database itself. We have the prize table, and we could, if we wanted to, write a query that said something like insert into dbo.prizes, and then put values, and then basically take that query and just paste it into code here and call it. But that's not really what I'd like you to do. Instead, what we're going to do is create a store procedure. Now we have already created some store procedures. We have the gets, get by tournament, for prizes, for team, and all the rest. But instead we're going to create a new store procedure. We'll delete this. Now we could keep this here, but I'm just going to delete all of this and start right from the create procedure. I would encourage you to put the comments up above that says who created it, when it was created, and what it was for. That's really helpful down the road. It's especially helpful if you put a changes section in there where every time you change the store procedure, you put a note as to what you did and when. Because that way you can see the history of the store procedure as well. So the name of this create procedure is DBO. We always start with DBO, unless we have a different namespace essentially in SQL. All right, so DBO dot, I'm going to start with SP prizes because this is on the prizes table. And we have this convention of starting with the name of the table. And now you know what parameters to pass in. And this is where it's beneficial to have two screens because you can put your prizes table on one screen and your store procedure on a different screen or something like that. What I'm going to do is and that's a type money. And at prize percentage, that's a type float. If I can spell it right. All right, so let's get rid of the comments here. Set no count on, what it does is it says, let's not pass back how many records you actually modified. And that's fine. So I'm going to say insert into dbo.prizes, and then I give it the 4 columns I want to put the values into. Place number, place name, prize amount, and prize percentage. Notice I don't insert the ID because the ID is going to be auto incremented. I can't write in that field, or I should. What that means is this value will be sent back to the person calling this store procedure, which is how I'm going to take the ID and send it back. But how do I get that ID? Well, I say select at ID equals scope identity. I'm done. So what this scope identity is going to do is say in the current scope, which means that in our case, just this store procedure call. Okay, so there is an idea of scope in store procedures, or in SQL, where you can say, I'm going to call these 3 store procedures in the same scope. And that'd be really helpful for bank transactions, where we could say, I want to take money out of a checking account and then in another call, put it into a savings account. We wouldn't want those 2 actions to be separated, because if you took money out of my checking account and then crashed, that money would go away. It'd be out of my checking account, but it wouldn't have gone into my savings account. And so we can link those together in what's called a transaction. So in that transaction, that would be the scope. But in this case, we're not saying specifically that I want a transaction. Instead, what happens is this call becomes its own little transaction. So in this transaction, I want to get the identity. What that is, the last identity written to a table. And so in this case, we only did one identity insert, and that's in the prizes table. So we said insert a new record, which would have created a new ID for that record. That ID is the last identity created. Therefore, when I ask for the last identity created, it's going to put the value of whatever is here into this variable. And since this variable is an output variable, I can then capture that on the other end. So I'm going to say execute, which is not going to run this store procedure, but instead create it. Now, don't do what I just did and have something highlighted and say execute, because you're going to get this error right here. This error says incorrect syntax near create. And you say, but that syntax looks right. Well, that's because I highlighted just this section. Remember that in SQL, wherever you highlight, that's the code that gets run, and that's it. So what I would do is either highlight the whole thing, or if this is the only thing in this file, then you can just highlight nothing and execute. I love the idea of highlighting just what you want, because that way, if you're in that habit, later when you have 2 statements in a file, you'll be more likely to protect yourself by highlighting just the statement you want versus being used to just hitting run on any blank file. I'm going to run this, and it says command completed successfully. And if I come down here, my store procedures, and I right click and say refresh, we will now see that I named this improperly. I named it SP prizes, but nothing else. Oops, no worries. We'll do this, SP prizes underscore insert. We'll run it again. And now if we refresh this, we see that we have the prizes, the wrong one, prizes get by tournament ID, and prizes insert. So how do we get rid of SP prizes? Well, I could right click and say delete. That works. I could also wipe this out and instead say something like drop procedure dbo.sp prizes. And it's not a list because IntelliSense has not updated for this window yet. So if I hit Control-Shift-R and wait for a minute, it will update, and then it will know that that's actually the correct file. And if we run this, it's completed successfully. And if I right click and say refresh on store procedures, the incorrect SP prizes goes away and life is good again. So the issue with programming is not that you don't make mistakes. We all make mistakes. The issue is knowing how to correct your mistakes and then also working at putting things in place to not repeat your mistakes. All right, so we have a store procedure. The store procedure's name is sp prizes underscore insert. And in fact, let's call that up. So I'm going to modify that. Notice the modification, when I right click and say modify, it brings it back up, but it has alter procedure instead of create procedure. And that's the syntax to modify a store procedure. So I'll keep that up, but we'll refer to that in a minute. Let's go back to our code. Okay, so we have our store procedure. We know how to at least put the information in if we were in SQL. So how do we do it in code? We're going to start off by saying var p equals new dynamic, if I can spell, dynamic parameters. I do a control dot on that and say using Dapper. This is a Dapper thing. So dynamic parameters, and we're just going to use var because it's a little simpler with something like this. But in here we can say p.add. And this is where it's a little trickier than the way we did it in our C# to SQL Server or SQL Databases video. But once you kind of see it once, I think you'll get the hang of it. So the first thing we need to do is add our variables. So and what are the variables we have? Let's do this. I'm going to copy these. I'm just going to shift tab once and copy these. And come up here. Let's do it up here. Paste them in, and I will then comment them out. So that just gives me my variables and what types they are. So I have them. So at place number is the variable name. And then the value is model.placeNumber. And that's it for that parameter. So what we're doing is we're creating a list of these parameters and we're adding them all to P. So p.add, and we'll say this one is model.placeName. And let's actually copy this place name and paste it here. P.add at prize amount. And that's model.prizeAmount. And then p.add prize percentage, model.prize percentage. Notice I tried the copy pasting thing from up here. It was just too distracting. When you're typing these out over and over again, trying to do it the same way every time, sometimes it's more distracting to try and copy something and paste it than it is to type it in. And if you have to later come back and copy and paste to make sure you got it right. So p.add, and this is the interesting one, ID, because this is the one that goes the wrong direction. It comes out, doesn't go in. So I'm going to pass a value in of 0. I'm going to say a db type. Oops, db type, colon. Notice it's trying to do the IntelliSense was trying to say, I think you mean db type with a capital D in the front, and that's not what I mean. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm saying we have optional items here. Notice a db type question mark and the parameter direction question mark. By saying db type colon, that's saying, yep, this is this parameter right here. Whatever's after the colon, that's its value. So that we can actually mix up the order if you wanted to, or when you have lots of these optional items, and there's even more with this right here, like with scale and precision and size and all the rest. When you have lots of these optional items, you can specify which ones you want to fill in and leave the rest blank. So db type colon, and the type here is db type dot, and here's the types we have. In this case, we want int 32, and that's the standard lowercase int. So that's what we want. So int 32, comma, direction, colon, and then notice when I hit space, it immediately opens up IntelliSense and goes right to parameter direction, because that's what it's expecting, a parameter direction. So if I hit tab, now I can hit dot, and I can say this is an output variable. So this parameter direction is a enum. Notice when you mouse over it, it says right there enum. So it enumerates the options we have available to us. In this case, we have a few. We have the standard input. We have input output, which goes both directions. We have output and we have return value. In my case, I'm using just an output, but if I wanted to, I could also pass information in on this ID value, in which case I could say input output. To change that in SQL, there's no change to make. As long as it's an output variable, I can use it as either an output variable in C# or an input output variable. And like I said, by default, they're input, therefore we don't need to specify because that's what it assumes. So output it is. So there's all of our variables and their values. Now I can say connection dot execute. And this is going to actually run some kind of store procedure, and it's assuming that nothing is going to come back as far as a data set goes. So what it's assuming is that we're not going to say, give me all of the prizes and return back a number of rows in a table. That would be a query instead of an execute. But with execute, it's saying you're just going to call something, probably an insert, an update, or delete, and not really pass information back. So we want to do an execute, and then we're going to say in double quotes dbo dot sp prize. I'm going to double check to make sure this is right. It's sp prizes underscore insert. So prizes underscore insert. Always make sure you get that right, because otherwise the first time you run through this, it will error. All right, the next parameter is our parameters. In this case, p. And then next, the command type, or I'd say command type. It's right down here, colon. Notice I'm skipping over a lot of these. I'm skipping over IDB transaction and the command timeout to go right to command type. And the command type is command type dot store procedure. Again, that's a enum, so it popped it up in the IntelliSense. I just hit tab, I hit dot, and it pulls up my options here, which are, looks like 3. Store procedure, table direct, and text. We want the store procedure option. All right, and that's all there is to it. Now, this code, and that's all there is, this code is going to execute this store procedure, pass in all of this information, and then it's going to get back information, but we haven't actually captured where this comes into. So let's do that. So I'm going to say, let's take the model itself. Let's just modify this. So model.id equals p, that's our dynamic parameters, p dot get, we have to do a less than and greater than signs because it's a get of t. What that means is that it's generic, meaning you can get any different type you want. You just need to specify the type inside of these angle brackets. So in this case, the type is an int. And then we put in quotes inside parens at ID. And what this will do is it will look at this dynamic parameters list called P. It's going to find this particular parameter by using this. And it's going to say, give me the value of this. And oh, by the way, it's of type int. Therefore, we can put it directly into my ID because my ID is also of type int. Quite a coincidence, right? Of course not. We planned it that way. All right. So finally, I return model. And now life is good. Or at least it's mostly good. Is you can also leave your application in an uncertain state, meaning maybe this is one of 3 tasks that need to be done, and it actually broke on task number 2 of 3. Well, that means that it got half done, and then the other half isn't done. How does your application recover from that? If you haven't planned a way to recover from that, it can actually be worse to have your application continue to run, because your user will continue to do more and more things to compound that error. And so sometimes the best thing to do is actually crash your application. Now, we're not going to say, okay, the solution then is just have no error checking. That's not the case. But I'm just saying that error checking is more than just saying wrap everything in a try catch. So we're actually going to have a lesson entirely dedicated to tracking and catching errors. And so we'll do that later on. But for now, we're going to leave this as it is and assume that things go well or everything will crash. So let's actually see if this works. And really, I don't have to do anything else to try it because we've already wired up. Remember the create prize form is already wired up to both a text file, a text connector, and also a SQL connector, which would be this one right here. And it already calls this create prize method. And we can see that in the code behind where we have this loop, and it's right, validate form. Oh, here we go. It's too simple. There's the loop. So for each iDataConnectorDB in global config.connections, and we said both SQL and text connector, I want you to call the create prize method, and here is the model, which just happens to be whatever you filled in here on our form. So it's already gets called. So let's run this and see if it actually works. Now before we do anything with it, and here's the form. Before we do anything, I'm going to go to my, close that out, and go to my database and do a new query. And say select star from DB 50%. Create prize, it goes blank. That's quicker that time. And if we execute this, we now see that we have a percentage of 50. So it's good to test these things out both ways just to make sure that things are working. And the other key thing here is to make sure that things are going in the correct fields. I've had that happen before where I'm putting stuff in the wrong fields. And so I try and, you find a 2 over here and a 1 over here. And you find these are empty or null or something like that because I try to put first place a string into a number field and that just doesn't work. And you'll go, oh, I swapped those two around. You go in the code and fix it. So it's just a matter of making sure that all the data goes in and it goes in the right spots. And I tested both the prize amount and the prize percentage to make sure that I indeed had both working the way I wanted them to. All right, I'm going to zoom out here. I'm going to minimize this and close this out. The one thing, and this is one of those things where this application is being built as if it were real world. And so I've left a couple of things in here that were frustrations that I found during the design process. But I'm like, you know what? No, I'm going to leave that in there and we're going to work through it live, essentially. Because I don't want to hide from you all the struggles that go on with the design process. Now, there's some things in here, I'm not trying to act like I know everything, okay? There's some things in here that'll pop up that I'm like, I didn't even think about that. But in this case, this issue is one that I came across in the design process and went, I wish that could be different. But that's the idea of having both the SQL connector and the text connector writing together, meaning they're both working. The issue with that is this ID right here. Now, if I write to SQL, I may get an ID of 25. But when I write to my text file may have less records in it. So I may get an ID of 15. When I go to use this value somewhere else, I can't have two different IDs to identify this one record. That's going to cause some confusion. Now, I could wire up my SQL connector to be the primary one, and then it's going to fall back to or have a copy written to the text file, in which case whatever ID SQL has will then take that and write it to the text file. That kind of works, but it kind of defeats the purpose of having that just drop in whichever one you want to do kind of database. So I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I'm going to say is fig. I want to change a couple of things. First of all, we're not going to have a list of iData connection. We're going to have a iData connection. That's it. And so when we initialize the connections, we're going to say if it's database, then the connection equals SQL. And then here, what we'll do is we will say else if. Remember before I said don't do else if because then you can only have one or the other? Well, now that's what you want. Else if, and we're going to say text file. So that solves at least this file, except for the fact that this isn't clean. So I'm going to change this to say string connection type. And then I'll say if connection type equals database, or let's be more specific, SQL. Else if connection type equals text, we can do that. Now we can come back and even make this a little bit cleaner. You know what? Let's make it cleaner. Again, this is part of that. Do you plan now or do you plan later? Let's plan now, and I'm going to add a enum here instead of a string because this is getting me a little bit nervous. Do you type SQL or you type, capital SQL or you type text file? That's just a little squirrely. So instead, I'm going to create an enum. And the way I do enums is I right click on my project and say add class, and I call it enums. Now you could create a class file for every enum, and that's fine. But what I do is I find I don't use enums that much, and instead of saying, oh, that's actually enums and where is that? I just create one file called enums and then wipe out the class inside of it and instead say public enum, let's call this database type. And we're going to say SQL and text file. So now I have SQL and text file. Get that out of there. So now I can come back over here. I can save that. Come back over here and instead say I want the database type. Now let's call it DB. And so now I'll change these again. DB double equals database type dot SQL. Or DB double equals database type dot text file. Now another way you could do this, instead of having your if, else if, and all the way down the row, you could do a switch statement. And enums are wonderful with switch statements because in enum, it has to know what the types are, at least currently. Now, when you go to Visual Studio 2017 and the C#7 features, the switch has gotten a really big upgrade where it doesn't have to have that very limited number of items it could be in the list. It can be pretty much anything, and it's pretty powerful. But in C#6 and below, in Visual Studio 2015 and below, the switch statement is limited to things like numbers, where it's very easy to say equals, so that value equals. So if I were to say, let's type it right here, switch, and I tab twice, switch on DB, and I hit enter, it's created case statements for me already. Case, SQL, case, text file, because that's an enum. It has a limited number of types. It has, in this case, just 2. And so I added 2 case statements we could have, and then also the default case. And that's essentially the same as this if, else, if with no else. You know, the default will be the else at the end. But I'm going to leave my code as it is. Switch statements at this point, you know, before 2017, are a little bit limited. I like this a little better, so I'm going to leave it as is. The great thing about programming is it really is up to you as a developer. All right, so I have this new way of doing things. Now if I come over to app.config, oops, I'm sorry, not app.config, program.cs. It now says, oop, you got a problem. Because I'm not passing in two Booleans, I'm passing in a database type, in this case, SQL. Now, if I didn't want to have that tracker library dot, I could delete that. Connections. So let's change this connections to be connection. I hit control dot. I'm going to say rename connections to connection. Let's go through and rename these two. And so now they are correct. I could have just renamed this, renamed anything that broke, but that's a little bit easier, and it does know about scope, so it knows what is really calling connections and what's not. But over here, global config, control dot connection dot create price. So we now know, let's just put that where it should go. So global config dot connection dot create price dot model. Which connection is it? Is it SQL? Is it text? Don't know, don't care, just know we're doing it. So again, all is right with the world. If we run this, we can create a new one. Let's create prize number 4, fourth, and the prize amount is a measly $5. Create the prize, it wipes things out. If we go back over to SQL and run this again, we see that in fact, yes, we have place number 4, fourth, and $5. What that means is all those changes, they all worked, okay? And we'll get into looking at testing a little bit and writing tests to check your application as well, because that can be helpful. But for now, we just ran a test ourselves just to make sure things worked. So with all those changes that happened, we've refactored our library to be a little cleaner. We have redone how our code works a little bit to make a little more sense with some of the things we thought through. And we've also, you know, it seems like a minor footnote now, but we've also connected to our SQL server and inserted a value into it every time we run this create prize. And oh, by the way, we learned about output variables and how to get them back using Dapper. So with all of that being said, that's it for this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to wire up the text connector. I think that should be a little bit less complicated, a little bit less of a video, because it should be a little more simple to just write to a text file. At least you'd think so. All right, so stick around for that next video.